Greetings, Culture Warriors. It is I, Jeff Ear, the author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest dispatch from the front. Another story out here from the world of the pandemic. This from Fox Business News. Childcare crisis pushes U.S. mothers out of the labor force. In August, the federal jobs report showed that women in their prime earning years were dropping out of the workforce more than other age groups. Angela Wynn had just launched her own project management business, hitting a career stride after years of struggle that began with earning an undergraduate degree as a single mother. Then the coronavirus pandemic hit, forcing many schools to shift online. The now married mother of 5 saw little choice but to give up her newly minted business to help 3 of her children cope with remote learning, while her husband, the primary breadwinner, kept his job at a senior living center. To see all that come to fruition, I did it, but now it's gone, said Wynn, who has always been the main caretaker for her children, ages 1, 5, 11, 12, and 18. But my priority is my kids, and their education is everything. Wynn's story is becoming distressingly common. Research is increasingly pointing to a retreat of working mothers from the U.S. labor force as the pandemic leaves parents with few childcare options and the added burden of navigating distance learning. The trend threatens the financial stability of families in the near term. In the long term, the crisis could stall, if not reverse, decades of hard-fought gains by working women who are still far from achieving labor force parity with men. Thousands of school districts are starting the school year with remote instruction, including most of the largest ones. At least half the country's child care providers are closed and may not survive the crisis without financial help to cope with implementing safety standards and reduced enrollment. Negotiations for a bailout of the industry have stalled in Congress. In August, the federal jobs report showed that women in their prime earning years, 25 to 54, were dropping out of the workforce more than other age groups. About 77% of women in that age group were working or looking for work in February, compared to 74.9% in August. The decline is most pronounced among black women of that age range, whose participation rate is down 5 percentage points since February, compared to 4 percentage points for Hispanic women and 2 for white women. Overall, the drop translates into 1.3 million women exiting the labor force since February. We think this reflects a growing child care crisis, BNP Paribas economists Daniel Ahn and Steve Weinberg wrote in a recent report. Editing continues to elude people. It is hard to see this abating soon, and if anything, could become worse as we move into fall. Few families can afford for mothers not to work indefinitely. Mothers are now the equal primary or sole earners in 40% of U.S. families, up from 11% in 1960, according to federal labor figures. Women also comprise nearly half the U.S. labor force, making their inability to work a significant drag on the economy and hindering any recovery from the pandemic's impact. In Wynn's case, she is working a part-time job to help pay the bills. Even so, the family has taken a financial hit, refinancing their home outside Nashville and starting a garden in their backyard to cut down on grocery bills. Despite the leaps over the past decades, working women still entered the pandemic at a disadvantage. They are typically paid 82 cents for every dollar men earn, according to research by the National Women's Law Center. Among working mothers and fathers, the wage gap is even higher at 70 cents. The median household earnings for mothers in the U.S. is $42,000 compared to $60,000 for fathers. When left with no choice but to give up one income as childcare options collapse, that wage gap incentivizes fathers to stay in the workforce and mothers to leave, or at least scale back. There is already a motherhood wage gap. In times of uncertainty and recession, you protect the primary earner, said Leanna Christian Landivar, a sociologist at the Maryland Population Research Center and author of the book Mothers at Work, Who Opts Out. That is bearing out in the numbers. More mothers than fathers have exited the labor force since the pandemic began, according to research published in August by Sage Journals, which analyzed data from the current population survey. Between February and April, labor force participation fell 3.2% among mothers with children younger than 6 and 4.3% for those with children 6 to 12. Fathers of children under 12 also left the workforce, but at lower rates, said Landivar, who co-authored the report. In a separate study, the same research found mothers are cutting back on working hours more than fathers. Mothers of children under 12 were working more than 6 fewer hours a week than fathers in April, compared to less than 5 fewer hours in February, according to the study, which looked at a subsample of heterosexual married men and women from the CPS, a monthly survey of 60,000 households sponsored by the U.S. Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We already knew there was a large gender inequality in the labor force, and the pandemic just makes it worse, Landivar said. All right, there's much more to the article there, but really it's just more detail on the same. Let's begin our analysis with this. There was an old joke about the New York Times in the 70s that said, that envisioned a headline which said, "Massive asteroid to strike Earth. Women and the poor expected to be hardest hit." And I think that applies to this article here. You have to look at the household as a unit that exists for providing for the children. And when you look at that unit, as I look at my own unit, you go through changes as different stresses happen economically. So in my case, been out of work now since April, when the pandemic lockdown began. And so my wife, who hasn't worked since we got married, previously her role was homeschooling the kids before we moved to another state. Once we got out here, we had a wonderful charter school, and the kids were of an age where we thought they could benefit from a little diversity in instruction. My youngest daughter was just 3, so she wasn't in school yet. My wife had to stay home with her anyway. And so we elected to begin this charter school experiment, which went fairly well right up until the pandemic. And then all of a sudden, the charter school, like so many others, changed in 2 fundamental ways. Number one was everything became virtual. And so now I had to spend $1,000 getting computers for my kids, because I've got 4 children, and with 3 of them in the school and having class instruction at the same time virtually, they each have to have a screen. With me working, trying to find a job, I need access to my screen down in the basement. And so you got to get more screens, which we did. Then you run into a situation where the instruction suddenly became much more problematic in terms of indoctrination. The goal being, obviously, to indoctrinate the children into the legitimacy of the lockdowns. And so precious class time was being devoted basically to supporting the illegal actions of the governor of the state. Well, of course, you can read the writing on the wall there. The charter school is dependent upon income from the state. The state was cracking down and indicating that it would tolerate no dissent from the governor, and that had to come through loud and clear in the instruction to the children. And so it did. The whole point of going to a wonderful charter school is to avoid the usual indoctrination that kids get in public education, which leads to a substandard education. We want kids to be good citizens of the United States of America, not good Democrats, which is what the governor wants. And so we took a look at it and said, well, we're just going to homeschool them again. I mean, what's the point, right? And so that's what we're doing. My wife has taken up the challenge again of homeschooling our 4 children. And of course, that means you have to pay for books, you have to pay for curricula. At a time when money is very tight, our expenses for education just went up significantly. But the long-term impact of having kids who are drones of the government versus having children who can think critically, well, so you do what you got to do. Such is the case with jobs and with households, is you have to decide how you're going to make ends meet under this unprecedented oppression. And fathers generally being wired to provide for their families find a way through by working and getting paid when the government allows us to. And women who are much more wired to care and nurture for the children during such times of stress, well, they gravitate towards that. And if you've been whipping up hysteria about a pandemic and you've been lying about the threat of that pandemic to children, then you can expect that the mothers of America are probably not going to want their children to be kept in daycare centers where they can be exposed to this virus that you've whipped all this frenzy up about. And that's what's happened. I suspect it's even happened where the mother has had the more lucrative job. This whole notion that parents are interchangeable in terms of care for the children is just utter nonsense. Fathers are good at some things, mothers are good at other things. But the absence of a mother or father is a real debilitating situation for a child. Their development is impacted by it. Life happens. Sometimes there's no alternative. It's not a choice made by most parents who are in a situation where they have to try to play both mother and father. But yet it happens, and there are consequences to that. If there's any good that comes out of the pandemic, I suspect it will be that mothers have been able to spend more time mothering their children. I hope that it will reverse some long-term trends which have made a two-income household almost a requirement to make ends meet. That was not the case for most of American history. For most of our history, one income was quite sufficient to provide for the family, even larger families than we have today. So perhaps that will reverse a situation which has led to so much misery. Because the other thing economically that you have to understand is as soon as you put women in a situation where they do not need a man in order to provide for the family, well, that encourages a whole bunch of behavior that is not good for society as a whole. Because if you have no dependence on a man, either because you're completely, entirely self-sufficient, as, say, a Hollywood actress is, successful one anyway, it frees you up to do all sorts of things that wind up in ugly memoirs from your children later. Or it makes you dependent on government. And neither of those things is conducive to the long-term health of either your children or our society. So it'll be interesting to track as we see so many different trends being upended in the pandemic, tracking the impact of having mom at home more. I'm certainly hoping that more mothers will choose to homeschool their children. Number one, you'll ensure that your children get a much better education than they otherwise would. Number two, you'll be able to teach your children morality in a way that public education only undermines these days. Number three, you'll reduce the power of the teachers' unions, which are in full control of one political party in the United States and are now refusing to go back to work out of sheer laziness. They want a free ride. They see the gravy train pulling up with a pandemic. And so reducing their power could be a very good thing for the overall health of the republic. Perhaps it's a chance to end the Marxist infiltration of our school system, which began all the way back in the days of Horace Greeley. That would certainly be a positive development. So it's not all bad news here, but I think the economic pain in the short term is very real. We're seeing a reduction in the quality of life, particularly of the middle class. And I would argue that the government's pandemic response has largely been focused on destroying the middle class in this country. It's the only common thread that you see in every one of these otherwise inexplicable policies. Why do you keep the liquor stores open but shut down the hair salons? Well, one thing explains it, and that's that you want small business owners such as run the hair salons, the middle class small business owners, to go out of business. And you want more alcohol dependency among those who are now unemployed to increase their dependence and reduce their resistance. Why are you making it harder for people to get guns to defend themselves given the riots that are going on? That's the same reason. Middle class shouldn't be allowed to defend itself. The rioters are not attacking the ruling class. The ruling class is steering the rioters. Look at all those pictures of our unmasked politicians with their arms around the rioters. And it tells you everything you need to know. But the thing about events such as these are that they're too big for the little minds that comprise the ruling class to fully control. And positive developments, liberty-enhancing developments, can come from these events. We talked in a prior podcast about the flight from these urban dystopias run by Democrats to other parts of the country. Now, there's a downside to that. If the people fleeing, for some reason, continue to vote the exact same way in their new home as they did in their old, then it becomes an invasion. But there's a positive consequence, and that's the collapse of those hellholes once and for all. Again, you feel badly for the people who remain, but increasingly those are the diehards anyway. And it's their own choices that are bringing about their ruin. So as we look at the values that are kind of in play with stories such as these, you have to look at a couple of things. How much do you value material wealth over the well-being of your children? Having personally made that sacrifice, I can tell you without question, I value the latter over the former. I want my kids to grow up and be good kids, good citizens, and have a good life. That's what I want. I'm willing to sacrifice in order to see that happen. And I know many, many millions of others feel exactly the same way. I hope the overwhelming majority. How do you value the maintenance of political power versus the health of the country as a whole? And obviously, the ruling class in this country will burn it to the ground rather than see their own political power over it diminish. Have they not made that eminently clear? I think they have. Do you value the historical role that the mother has played in the family? Or do you value the new feminist ideal? I think that has to be weighed. And I think for many women, they're finding that the new feminist ideal is in fact a raw deal, jeopardizing their relationship with their children, which gives them far more happiness for the sake of a title or a greater salary, which ultimately just becomes empty. You know, there's a reason why so many CEOs are divorced. And people who wish to be CEOs ought to think about that before they head too far down that path. These are the values that are in conflict and have to be kind of resolved by each of us individually as we plot the course of our own lives. Now, in parting, I would like to note that this pandemic has caused an unprecedented amount of pain to families across the country. And if you're out there and you're feeling that pain, I just want you to know that you're not alone. This is an unprecedented disaster brought to us courtesy of the United States government. The situation that we're in, by and large, is not our fault. The reason that the government is paying out stimulus money and enhanced unemployment benefits is because they recognize that it is not our fault, and they are trying to buy our acquiescence. They're trying to keep us from taking to the streets in anger over what has been done to us. So I would encourage anyone who's struggling in this environment to stay the course. The great man of the 20th century was Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister. And a lot has been claimed about what he wrote and said, but here's one that was true and stemmed from his own experience during the Great Depression, when he was out of power and having to work for a living, which was not the norm in aristocratic families such as he came from. And he said this: if you're going through hell, keep going.